Okay, rank these in order of 1 is your most favorite, 7 is your least favorite. So although everyone has the ability to participate in this right now, which is fun, this is a joint STAC and FAC meeting. So in the future, during the presentation, when we ask these questions, I'd like to limit the participation to just the committee members. So thank you for helping us out with that. Okay, 22 of you got there. Okay, moving on. We're ready to dive in. Funnel cake is number 1. I knew it was going to be. I knew it was going to be number 1. Kettle corn number 2. Tied with beer, which is awesome. Corn dogs, turkey leg, deep fried anything, and spinach bread. Yeah, spinach bread always comes in last. I'm sorry. Anyway. Okay, 28 of you have responded.
Nice.
Okay, moving on. So we're going to go through a couple of reminders. I know we have some members of the public online. I know that I want this group to also be reminded, what is this? What is the Long Range Transportation Plan and Freight Plan? So the Long Range Transportation Plan or Freight Plan, we're calling it Alaska Moves 2050. It's a statewide policy plan that's going to outline high-level goals, policies, and investment strategies, in addition to measurable actions for an adaptable and resilient transportation system. This will serve all Alaskans, businesses, and visitors far into the future to 2050. Again, it's a high-level policy document, and it will not identify individual projects. So this plan will also include a freight element to guide and maintain the freight transportation system in order to strengthen the state's economy and raise the quality of life for all of us. Just as a detail, the freight plan will identify different projects and specific projects, okay? So this is required by federal regulation and also by state statute, okay? Again, this is another reminder, the role of the STAC and the FAC. The two groups are meeting jointly today. Through information, discussion, review, your role is to advise DOT on the transportation and freight policies and programs and investments. Through a series of meetings, you've already participated in a handful, open discussions, respect diversity of all interests and opinions, commit to regular participation, which you've already done, provide solutions-oriented collaborative input that provides the best end result for Alaska, and help identify obstacles, challenges, inefficiencies in the current system, and then proactively identify emerging trends that may impact transportation. So again, thank you for your participation in this. Okay, planning process update so far. So a lot has happened since the last time we met. The planning process is broken into kind of 3 sections right now: data collection and analysis, strategic direction, and then the plan development phase. So right now we're kind of straddling the data collection and analysis phase and the strategic direction phase. Today we're going to be presenting the elements of the financial analysis technical memorandum, which is the 3rd technical memorandum. And then we're going to start talking about some of the elements that are going to lead into the vision, goals, and performance measures. So these driving factors that we're going to talk about today are the things that are going to start leading us into the strategic direction phase. Just as a reminder, this process includes a series of 5 technical memorandums, and those technical memorandums are going to lead into the final plan, so that at the end, it's not new information. These are things we've already talked about. Quick update about the state.
Holly, I just want to kind of go back to the technical memorandums. So part of the purpose of those is to identify any gaps, get initial feedback, and then go ahead and revise them. So they will roll into the final plan. They are not considered the final plan, but they do inform it. A lot of the information is final, but they're essentially progress reports, and they do help us identify gaps where we need to go back and get more information. So it is meant to be an iterative process to bring everybody along with us. So like Holly said, when the final plan comes out, there are no surprises.
Okay. All right. Another part of your role is to help us with stakeholder outreach, right? And you all did a really great job helping us. Some of the statewide survey results, there'll be a full report online soon. But just initially, we had almost 2,500 total responses. And we think the distribution of responses throughout the state is really good. So some of the initial results that we've heard when visiting family and friends, respondents primarily use personal vehicle, 78%, plane, 45%, and ferry coming in third. And again, I'm not sure this is going to be a total surprise, but the top priorities for survey respondents were regular maintenance, long-term funding, improved ferry service, improved roads and bridges, and more options for walking and biking. Adequate maintenance and reliability of the system was a constant theme, and I'm sure no one's surprised to hear that. Okay.
And we believe that it is the most responses that the statewide long-range transportation plan update has ever had. So we're pretty happy with 2,400 people responding across the state. It was a huge push. Thank you to all of you for helping get that out. It made a huge difference. So we've got some good data and we'll get more out to you soon.
Okay. So Mike, I'm going to pass it off to Mike Fisher of Northern Economics, and he's going to go through a snapshot of the financial analysis.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so I'll just be hitting a few of the highlights from the financial analysis memorandum. And really, we tried to summarize kind of the bigger picture of that work with this graphic. And this graphic is still a work in process, but it provides a high-level summary of how funds are generated by transportation, how those funds go into the state, how the state's budget and federal money are then combined to form the transportation budget. And then the third column, the uses of that budget, what services are provided by it. As you can see, the revenue that we have coming in from fuel taxes and other taxes and user fees amounts to less than $100 million versus the total state tax revenue of about $1 billion. When you add in other unrestricted general fund money, it adds up to over $6 billion, of which transportation gets a $234 million slice. And this is all looking at 2020. And to that slice, we add more than $1 billion of federal funds. As we all know, federal money, we leverage it, it pays for a lot of our transportation infrastructure. And then the column, the right column just goes over a number of the services provided. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, because you won't see it mentioned later on, is we don't have rail here. And that's because, as you recall, we're looking at services that are managed by DOT. And while the financial analysis memo does talk about the rail system, it's a separate entity. And so we're not actually including that in a couple of slides today. All right, next slide, please.
And Mike, one more quick clarification on that. To be very transparent, you'll see that active transportation at 0.3% comes in very low. That's one specific grant pot of money. It does not account for all of the trails and sidewalks that DOT provides as part of existing road projects. So there's a lot of active transportation in that 66% as well. So it's counted in two places.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you for mentioning that. And I saw that the question come up about the local match, and that's correct. So this is what the state is putting into these services.
Okay, so we have two hands raised. I'm going to take two questions. Does that sound good, team? Okay, we'll go to Steve Robucco first. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, just a quick question on the graphic. All the way over on the right-hand side, Mike, where there's 1.3% for the Alaska Marine Highway System, And that's a container ship. Is the Alaska Marine Highway System in this context ferries, or is it in fact container, cargo deliveries?
That is a choice, the first choice. That was just a poor choice for the graphic. And, you put together graphics and don't see things. And thank you, Steve, for seeing that. Wait, that's going to the Port of Alaska. That's not going AMHS. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
There's nothing going to ports.
Right. We will
Right.
clarify that. Thanks, Steve. That should be a ferry.
It's
Thank
a
you.
ferry with really colorful windows. That's what it is.
They're Lego people.
Okay, go ahead, Joe.
Sorry if I missed it. What is the difference between statewide aviation and AIAS aviation?
So AIAS would be the International Airport System, and so that's Anchorage and Fairbanks. And then we have statewide aviation, which we're working on revisions to this graphic, and we're going to be calling it rural aviation. And that really refers to all of the other airports that DOT manages. 232, I believe, or 242, just off the top of my head. So that's the designation or the distinction. All right. So looking at the operating budget, you can see that there are a lot of different sources for the budget. The largest ones come from the Capital Improvement Program, General Fund receipts, the International Airport Revenue Fund, and then the Marine Highway System Fund. As you get to the smaller slices of that pie, you start to see some of the taxes and user fees that go into the budget. And there are user fees inside some of these categories, for example, in the international airports and in AMHS. But in terms of highways, which doesn't have those kinds of user fees, you start to see those show up in those smaller slices with motor fuel tax receipts, aviation fuel taxes, vehicle rentals, and so on. Next slide, please. So then this pie is showing us a capital budget picture, and this is not where the money is going, but these are where the funds are coming from. Federal receipts, as we saw before, are the major source of the pie. 1.1 billion out of about 1.4 billion total. The next largest fund, the Constitutional Budget Reserve, most of that money is actually going to the state match. And so about 90% of that is going to support that 1.1 billion in federal receipts. And I saw some hands coming up if we have questions.
Yep, go ahead, Aves.
Had to find my unmute button.
Mm-hmm.
On the previous chart, I believe it was showing revenue sources.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't see a caption there for motor vehicle registrations.
Let's see. I would need to go back. You're correct. That is one of the sources. There are registrations and there's license fees and a few others as well.
Looking at some of the other numbers, the motor fuel or motor vehicle registrations, including commercial motor vehicle registrations, are a significant number.
Mm-hmm. I would need to go look at the numbers. I suspect those are passing through the general fund. And so they're concealed in that way.
Okay, we'll go to Rich next.
So on this graphic, out of the DOT's operating budget, 93 million comes from the International Airport Revenue Fund. Is that correct?
Right.
And can you go back one more slide then? No,
The other
back.
way. The other way.
Yeah, the other way. So, okay, so the International Airport is about 10% of the funding flow, but contributes 16% of the operating budget. Is that correct?
I'd have to look at the numbers rather than try to confirm them. The numbers here, though, for that slice of the pie, that is the unrestricted general fund. And so if you go to then the budget, you see that the general fund, specifically unrestricted general fund, is a portion of that. And then we have some other flow throughs. So I think the numbers get a little confused depending on how you slice and dice them.
So those are good points. So when we are finalizing the draft financial analysis, we'll make sure we're really clear and transparent on how these charts compare to one another and answer those questions. So this is great feedback, and we'll come back with clarity on those.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, are you ready to move on, Mike?
Yes. Okay. So then we talked about the capital fund, and I just wanted to mention really quickly that of the federal funds, the 1.1 billion, about 690 million goes to surface transportation, 374 million goes to airports, and then the remainder goes to a variety of smaller uses. So on this slide, the match money for highways is mostly the federal money is mostly going to highways and aviation, and of course that makes sense because the FHWA and FAA funding programs are of course the major ones that we use. When we look at what the state itself has spent directly, we see that a lot of money does go to highways, about 3/4 of it, but the state has also, of course, supported AMHS and to a limited extent harbors, mostly through the harbor matching grant program. All right, next slide. So next we wanted to just look quickly at those three modes of highways, aviation, and AMHS, and just look at the money that's coming in. So for highways, we had looked at a Congressional Research Service report that looked at the highway funding formula at each state and then how each state ranked on a per capita basis, per land area basis, per lane mile, and then per VMT. So on the next slide, we looked at a number of states that we considered our peers, and there are a couple of reasons why for that, based on their location, the level of infrastructure development, population, economies, and so on. And so these charts just give you a sense of where we stack up to some of these comparison communities. The columns that are labeled for Alaska are of note because Alaska ranks either the top or the bottom relative to other states when we look at highway apportionments. By person and by VMT, we are #1 in the nation, or we were as of 2018, out of the 50 states and Washington, D.C. That makes sense. We have a small population and therefore lower VMTs. We are second highest in the nation per lane mile. I don't have in my notes who the first place one was, but again, we have a limited road system, so that impacts things. And then likewise, we were 51st out of 51 for apportionment per square mile because we are such a large state and we have a very limited road system. All right, slide. Now looking over at aviation, we wanted to take a snapshot of airport improvement program funding and internally generated revenues. For rural aviation, AIP funding has been around 120 to 150 million per year, although in 2020, that number was nearly 200 million, so quite a bit higher. That counteracts the fact that the rural system only generates a small amount of revenue. In 2020, about $5.5 million in revenue. On the other hand, the international system generated about 135 million in revenue, and it's able to support a lot more of its operations, of course, from the revenues it can charge its users. It received AIP funding of $26 million in 2020. And as you can see, it's typically been in the $30 to $60 million range for federal funding. Right. Slide. And then we wanted to throw in a slide for AMHS. And this is just a snapshot from the 2020 annual report for the ferry system. Now, I wanted to point out that the operating revenues, they're shown here as 28 million. Typically, they are going to be about twice that. In 2019, they were around $50 million. And of course, there were just a number of factors that came in and impacted the ferry system from July 1st, 2019 through June 30th of 2020. When we look at the revenues, the highway system, marine highway system, 80% of it that in 2020 came from ticket sales, along with some passenger, like some onboard support with staterooms and passenger services. In a more typical year, it would be a higher percentage, of course, for ticket sales, but those are still the main three categories. On the operating expenditure side, for 2020, the expenditures were $95 million, understandably driven by marine vessel operations as well as fuel and shoreside support.
Okay.
Now, I can pause here for some questions.
Yep. First, I'm going to ask Robert. I know you had your hand up. Do you still have a question, or are you good?
Thank you. I do, but it was on the previous slide.
I'll go backwards. That's fine.
So for rural airports, I'm just curious, when you say airport funding, what does that really talk about and encompass? Because it seems that from what I'm hearing from rural communities, this is a very narrow focus. And so if airports are needing, restrooms, pavilions, whatever support infrastructure that is really connected to the airport to make it function for the community, that's not qualified or counted for as DOT transportation funding. Can you clarify that?
I would have to go back and come up with a better answer to that. But I do know that for a lot of those airports, there are fees that could be charged, but that are not necessarily being charged. And that's because operators are building their own facilities and providing those things. Obviously, yeah, the state, it funds plenty of projects. Obviously, there's a lot of federal funding that goes into that. But at the local level, there's some limitations in terms of what they're providing. And I see that Mark has his hand up, and maybe Mark, you could chime in for that as well.
Sure, Mike. Yeah, I think Robert. I think a lot of the type of projects that you mentioned may or may not necessarily qualify as an FAA funded project, right? And even if it did, in some cases, because there are so many needs. I mean, you see $200 million for 240 airports around the state, right? So because those needs are so great, oftentimes some of those projects just don't raise to the level of being able to be funded because of the fact that there are so many other pressing needs like runway resurfacing, new taxiways, those type of things. So I think, or even new equipment that they're using to keep those runways up. So I think that's maybe why just some of these projects that the community's identified that would be very helpful, because certainly in the winter, having a shelter at a small rural airport would be useful. It's just they don't meet the level of need, or they're just not fundable under FAA. So that's I guess the best answer I can come up with at this point.
No, thank you. And that's exactly what I wanted to get on the table, because this planning process that we're engaged in is not looking at only fundable FAA projects or just whatever the narrow scope of affordability that is offered to us, if we're looking at what the total needs are for community transportation, I wanted to make sure that this is at least on our radar and it's being acknowledged somehow in the planning process. So if communities have to go after different funding sources, fine, but at least recognizing the importance that some of these infrastructure pieces play in the transportation system. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, Rich, you're up, and then we'll go to you next, Gordon. Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, just in the chat, I believe it's Mike Fisher states that there's no general funds going to the Alaska International Airport System. They fund themselves. I mean, can you clarify that?
Mark, I think you put that in the chat as a point of clarification.
No, I think that was Rebecca. Is that what you're referring to, the AIP eligibility rules?
No, Mike Fisher. We're going to have to review the AIAS funding because there's no state funding attributed to AIAS. Their budgets.
Yeah. So the point is that you know, the International Airport System's budget is generated and approved by the legislature, but really it's the budget that that's generated from their the revenues that they generate at the airports, and so there really truly isn't any unrestricted general funds that are contributing to the AIS's budget. I guess that was what I want to make.
Right. So this suggests that they're taking in money from the state when really they're paying their own way rather than being funded.
That is correct. No general funds pay for the AIAS.
So we might want to clarify that.
Yep. So we'll make sure that's clear.
Okay, we'll go to Gordon next. Go ahead, Gordon.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can hear you great.
Okay, I'm participating partly on the, I'm watching the screen, but I got to participate on my teleconference line as well. Anyway, I'm fairly new to this transportation committee, and you know, I represent North Slope Borough up here in the Arctic, and you know, we had recently redeveloped our port authority into a department of the borough. It was an independent organization at first, and which we had very hard time getting it underway. But having said that, you know, it is a department now and has a budget, but we're still waiting on appointments of folks for that department. So in the interim, the Department of Planning and Community Services is functioning to work on certain things, and one of them was the long-range development plan for the Port Authority, which was adopted by our Assembly July 12 of this year, 2021, in to round off the department's tools to get underway. But in the interim, I'm working to understand better this transportation mechanism, and the funding here is important to understand for me. And we are working with Alaska DOT on airport transitions. The North Slope Borough already owns, I think, 7 runways that we're dealing with. And I was intrigued about, you know, shelters, maybe through the AIP, and thinking about the very rural nature of our communities like Barter Island, on up to Pass, Point Hope, Point Lay, Wainwright, and many of them, you know, they don't have shelters or terminals. They're non-certificated airports, but we are working towards the transition of a certificated airport to the borough with DOT. But I'm wondering about the fundability of maybe a small terminal because of, you're gonna have to stay in your vehicle until an airplane comes. And a lot of times it's 40 below zero. And on top of that, we have things like foxes that are, a lot of our communities go into quarantine annually for rabies, and because of the rampant running around of foxes and things like that. The other part is like polar bears that are roaming around and things like that. So I just was wondering about the fundability of something like that, and I'll just leave it at that. I just wanted to chime in to say we exist up here in the Arctic.
So Gordon, thank you for your input. From your participation in the past, I know you're really interested in public-private partnerships to be able to pursue the goals that you've outlined in your local plans. So I think it's very important to keep coordinating your local plans with the statewide plan. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I
Okay.
also think based on these comments, Mike and team, I think it's going to be helpful to just do a kind of a quick summary of how the airport funds work and what they can and can't be used for, so that we have some separation there. And I think that will add some clarity.
Okay, Mark, I'm just going to go to you before we move on here. I know there was one other question from Rebecca, and I'm wondering if you can address that quickly or if that's for a future discussion.
Which question?
So
is
there
that?
was a question, and maybe Wendy, you can decide if this is now or later, but AIP has strict eligibility rules for what is allowed to construct under the funding.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was referring to. We can address and come back with some of that information, because I think that'll be really helpful for the rural airports to understand what funding can be used for what.
Yep.
And then I think Terry had a question.
Good afternoon. Thank you for letting me ask my question. Just very quickly on the Alaska Marine Highway operating revenues, is there any delineation between cargo revenue as it relates to ticket sales, or does that fall under other unrestricted revenue?
Okay, who's taking this one? We got Mike, Mark, or Wendy?
That's got to be a Mike question, I think.
Okay, Mike, you are on mute, so you need to come off mute if you're going to be talking.
Sorry, yeah, I would need to look into the answer. So
okay, that's fair. I don't want to slow us down anymore. I just wanted to try to understand where the freight element plays into their revenue sources, because we do use them in a very specific lane, and it's come up several times. So we can discuss it at a later date. Thank you for the consideration.
And
Yeah,
Terry,
and
this Mark, you can, certainly there are different ticket price, different prices, depending on a freight or a personal vehicle. And as Mike said, I think there is a way to, get that information parsed out from AMHS, but I'm not sure whether Mike got that at this point.
Just trying to find out if it's even a priority worthy of consideration, or if it's just kind of an incidental. Again, we do use that segment or that lane for support, and I'm just trying to understand whether it's even worthy of consideration, or whether it's just a by the way type thing. No need to tie up the meeting any further.
Yeah, but again, thank you for these questions and this dialogue, because this really helps us, hone in on the freight plan, hone in on this memo. So I can't thank you how much the last meeting, nobody spoke. So thank you so much for bringing all these up. These are great questions, and it adds value to the process, and you're doing your jobs.
I wanted to just really quickly mention, and Robert put it in the chat, but if a personal vehicle, someone drives a pickup or a van or something onto a ferry and loads it up with cargo, I don't know that that's necessarily tracked, because it's being tracked just by the vehicle. So we would have to see where we could dig out the commercial freight side of things, but in terms of the non-commercial, it's a lot more difficult to really understand how that all comes together. So
yeah, again, appreciate the consideration of the dialogue. I don't want to tie us up anymore. We've got a lot of material to cover.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
And I wanted to mention quickly, the chart that had the budgets, as I mentioned, that was showing the source of funds, not necessarily uses of funds. And so while, for example, the airport money is coming in, it's not going out to, I mean, it is going out outside of AIAS slightly, but most of it's just going right back in. And general funds are also part of that budget, but they are not going to AIAS. If you look in the chat, I added a link for you to look at later. It just has a website that maps out where the funding sources are coming from and where they're going, which makes that clear. It's just difficult to fit onto a screen. All right, so let's see. So that brings us to state revenues. And, so we've talked about where funding is coming from for the different modes and what our budgets are. Now, if we take a step back and look at the state level, I mean, as we're all aware, the state has a lot of competing interests. We have a lot of departments that are demanding a lot of money for operations and capital. And with oil revenue declining, we have seen the state drawing on savings to a large extent in recent years. And then starting in 2019, we started to use the percent of market value draw. And this chart shows how revenue overall has declined, and then the introduction of that PUMV draw. What that means as we think about this, just to set needs into context, in a lot of ways, we are on a fixed income. We saw in the earlier DOT budget that there were a couple categories of funding that were kind of use related. So if people buy more fuels for highway vehicles or for aviation or for boats, that contributes a little bit, but it's a very small piece of the pie. And so as we think about addressing needs, how do we raise the money to do that? If we go to the next slide, this is just a very high level look now at what some of these bigger needs are. And this is not comprehensive by any means. As I'd mentioned, since the railroad operates independently, we don't have their capital needs shown here, but past studies have put the backlog of highways work over $400 million. And we've talked to stakeholders who've said that it just keeps growing. And there are plenty of annualized needs as well. Aviation, we've seen needs in excess of $1 billion. And there are these ongoing maintenance and operations needs. And AMHS, there's been an operating gap. It has been 100 million in the past. It was 75 million in 2020. It was actually better in 2019, but that system has operated at a gap. And one of the big projects that has made the news is the need to replace the Tustamina, which is approximately $238 million replacement. As with all of these assets, across all modes, aging facilities means higher costs, the need for replacement, and so on as we go forward. And so all of those things mean that we need to find a way to fund them. And we're in a constrained fiscal environment. So that's where we're really looking to this advisory group to help to guide that discussion and to start to identify the solutions. So just to wrap up the financial discussion, we have challenges with maintaining assets. We have deferred maintenance that just keeps growing and growing because we have heard that we're just not keeping up with maintenance and operations needs. We have heard that federal funds have taken over state funds to help with some of those needs, but that there's a lot less flexibility. So if a federal dollar is designated for a specific mode and use, and another need comes up, well, if the money can't be used for what the original need was, you can't just transfer it to this new one. So there's a lot less flexibility than with state dollars. And our capital spending has been limited. That's not to say that's necessarily a bad thing, because as you create new assets, of course, you create these obligations to maintain them. So capital spending needs to be done smartly. The important piece, though, is that when the state has spent on capital, it has been able to leverage federal funds quite substantially. Depending on the program used, it could be 10 to 20 times the amount of impact of a single state dollar. Next slide. So the key findings in terms of funding, as we know, as we've just seen, the government is on a mostly fixed income, and the fiscal structure does not really have a lot of revenue sources that allow it to grow with population and economic growth and address transportation needs that are generated from transportation use. If there is going to be a catching up of maintenance and operations and reduction of the backlog and so on, it will require some kind of a new source of revenue or a new way to fund these improvements. All right, so with that, I will.
Okay, so I'm going to do two things here. So Jody asked for a clarification in one of the slides, and I just want you to address that first, Mike. And that was since the international airport system is funded independently through the IARF, the $1 billion need for aviation, is that only representative of the rural airports?
I believe that's correct. I don't know, Mark, if you can answer that. That was one of the numbers that we had found for the report, or maybe Wendy.
Yeah, I think overall, Jody and all the aviation folks, we're going to do a whole lot better job of breaking and being very transparent what's rural and what's AIAS, the international system, and make that very transparent through this, and then how that money impacts the overall revenues and contributes to that. So we'll add a lot of clarification as we move forward with this.
Okay, so thanks. Robert, you had your hand up first. Go ahead, and then we'll get to you next, Joe.
Well, anybody that knows me knows that slide was not going to get past without a comment. Operating gap, I don't know what that's. I know the explanation that was given was fine, but I don't think you want to let the slide deck out for the public record. That, I mean, if you want to say the state's cut service operating, $100 million, that's fine, but that number gets used in the wrong context for the wrong reasons if it's left stating just that. I'm not sure if that's the best word choice and the best number on there. Right now, I think globally we've got a $50 million plus subsidy and a $50 million DGF if we get lucky on revenue, but that gap number doesn't sit right with me. And the Malaspina was stripped down a couple of years ago. It's got huge capital. I think it's headed for the reefs or India someplace. I understand the context of what that's trying to say, but I don't know that the public, when they get this slide deck, is going to understand that at all either. So I just.
Okay, I think it's important. I think the next step would be to double check what that means. So we'll do a better job of that.
And before we publish it, we'll make some clarifications there.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so Joe, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, clarify and make sure that I understand the scope of the long-range transportation plan, because when we look at DOT and public facilities, like a lot of that operating budget goes to the maintenance of the public facilities aspect of it. And when we're talking about transportation, I just want to make sure the numbers, are looking at the transportation costs and things of that nature, and not the public facility aspect of it. On the federal level, it's just DOT, but here it's DOT and PFs. So I just wanted to make sure we were, aware of that, or set me straight that we are including PFs when we're talking about transportation.
No, we're talking about transportation only, but we're using the full department's name, but we are not including public facilities in our numbers. Those are stripped out, but we continue to use DOT's full acronym.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but that's a good question.
Okay. All right. Okay, we're gonna ask maybe a tricky question, but we're asking it. Okay. Remember, 3 ways that you can get to the survey here. How should the state prioritize the following funding options to meet transportation needs? So I want you to pick 3. Pick your top 3 choices. So understanding that there's significant funding challenges, what 3 would you pick? If you need to get to this through your browser again, it's in the website. It's in the chat. But if you just go to the same place you were before, you'll find it. Again. What would be your top 3?
And this is anonymous, so don't worry about that.
Yeah. Yeah, please don't, we don't know who says what. Okay. So for those of you who might just be on the phone, how should the state prioritize the funding to fill the gap or to meet transportation needs? So the choices are increase user fees, increase transportation related taxes, such as the fuel tax, state sales tax, additional user fees, state income tax, privatize infrastructure. Hold on. Toll roads, sell things, none of the above. So 18 of you have participated so far, 20. So when picking 3, looks like 55% at the top, increase user fees, such as marine highway system rates, airport passenger fees, increase transportation related taxes, such as fuel taxes or tire fees. These 2 are kind of staying at the top right now. State sales tax comes in next, additional user fees after that, increased transportation related fees after that. So this is interesting. Looks like we have maybe a discussion item from this, and go ahead, Rich. Keep voting.
Yeah, no, I had to turn on my microphone. So I'm assuming that any funding we're talking about is excluding any anticipated funds from federal infrastructure that's coming at any point in the future?
Yeah, I think this is trying to identify additional, how can we meet the need? This isn't intended to say that the federal funds would fill that need.
Yeah, so part of it is you've got to come up with a match for those federal funds to leverage those dollars. And then, the full disclosure with all of this funding, of course, is what's happening on the national level with the new transportation bill and what that looks like. So we are monitoring that closely. We aren't 100% sure what that's going to look like yet, but it's got to be settled here in the next couple of months, I would hope. And then we will get everything updated and report back on what that means for statewide transportation as well.
Okay, go ahead, Robert, and then we'll move on.
I'm just curious if any of the brave souls that said other either think that the status quo is great or if they have some other ideas. I'd love to contemplate what other ideas are out there. If not today, at some point, they have something in mind.
Does anybody else have an additional unique idea that you might want to bring up? It's okay if you don't. But it's a good question, Robert. Thanks.
And you can toss it in the chat if you don't feel comfortable speaking up. You can send it to us via email. We can report back at the next meeting. Whatever makes you comfortable. We'd love to hear from you, but there's lots of ways to do it.
This is Gordon Brown.
Go ahead, Gordon, and then we'll move on to the driving factors.
Okay. I do supplement my own needs that I do, like for our community winter access trails program within the North Slope Borough, and it's a improved snow trail system.
sorry, Gordon. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's about a 300-mile improved snow trail to connect smaller villages to the rural hub up here in the Arctic, and I supplement those types of resources through grants, including, I get a budget annually from appropriations and things like that to carry out the trails program. It seems to me that as the borough is a municipality, it qualifies for grants, and seems to me that's where I would try to leverage additional resources to, if we were struggling in that way. Just, I don't know that's what you were looking for.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think for smaller, maybe not bigger projects, but smaller projects, finding grants like that, I think that's great. Thank you, Gordon.
All right, so
driving factors.
Moving into the driving factors, we've got about a half hour left. I'm going to trust that most of you did your homework and that we can have a pretty lively discussion rather than having me read each one and talk too much. So the purpose of these driving factors are really, what are those elements in Alaska that are most likely to influence the infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure system today and into the future? So these are kind of the levers we're going to pull that's going to have the greatest impact on how people and goods move across the state. So we developed, we might have 10 driving factors. I don't know that I updated this slide. We added one new one, but largely they're around the environment, the socioeconomics, political, and technological. And we're going to use these driving factors to help set goals for the long-range transportation plan. We're going to help them to create scenarios. If this happens, then what does our future look like? And we're going to talk about scenarios later, but we really want to kind of say, do you agree with these driving factors? Have we missed any? So that then we can set our goals, our scenario planning, and our performance measures. So they really go kind of around these key themes, which is connectivity. We've talked a lot about that. Connectivity between modes, broadband and internet connectivity, new technologies. Workforce is a relatively new one that we've added. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The economic and natural resource development kind of goes hand in hand in Alaska. Climate change, population, and then with population, we also came up with migration, and that's related to population, a little subtle difference there. And then of course, funding. So kind of would like, I hope you've read them all. I know a lot of you ranked them early, but I'd like, yes, we've nailed it. No, we missed it. Or have we thought about this? So really connectivity it's everything, right? It's getting from the airport to the ferry, getting the freight from the road, from the port to the road to the people. So by having any broken connections or not strengthening those, that impacts how people move and goods move across our state. So any thoughts, comments on this one? Resonates as true. It's a driving factor.
Can I add something to this, Gordon Brower?
Yes.
I was in a workshop maybe 2 years ago, and it was describing Alaska North Slope as a economic underserved, I forgot the term. It was a underserved and designated as an opportunity zone. And I'm wondering, that could be a category. There's a lot of resources up here in the Arctic, and we're, our communities up here are only served once annually when the ice melts by barge, and and we're trying to work with the climate change issues, most notably the ice road season used to start somewhere around November. The tundra is now more open, according to policies that we hold, somewhere around mid to late December, and a lot of times the past 10 years on into January, where it's adequate snow and the frost depths have met the criteria. So even the industry, the oil industry, struggles up here with construction season is normally wintertime up here in the Arctic, where ice roads and things are developed, but more so the needs of the communities and the comprehensive plans that we develop for each community tell us about economic conditions, the very costly living conditions in the Arctic, and how the North Slope Borough has to subsidize general living conditions up here for all of its communities. And I'm wondering about, some of the projects like the Deadfall Synclines coal mining demonstration project in 1989, and the reasons why those never ever took off is no way to bring those types of resources to market. I mean, there's a 200-year supply of metallurgical coal. It's the cleanest type of coal for shipbuilding, and then resources like lead and zinc that are abundant resources up here in the Arctic that are. Anyway, I'm just thinking about some of these categories about, the administration I had been in the workshop about opportunity zones, that there should be some incentives to look at the North Slope as an economically depressed area and for it to be an opportunity zone. I'm not sure if you've heard those kind of things before.
I have heard about those kind of things, Gordon, and I think that's interesting. We'll look into it. Maybe some sort of economic opportunity zone. Thank you very much. Okay. Are you ready to move on to the next one, Wendy?
Yeah, let's go on to the next one, because I think that one's pretty straightforward. So the next theme is obviously broadband and internet connectivity. It seems a little bit odd in a transportation plan. You're seeing them in almost all transportation plans now, especially as we move into things like e-commerce, telemedicine, educational access, and data, and how we evaluate our transportation systems. So there's a need for increased broadband and internet connectivity to make our transportation networks, all modes, as efficient as possible and to really serve our populations better. So adoption of new technologies, this is a broad one. We're going to have to start thinking about how we change the ways we think about technology. If we look at the new transportation infrastructure bill, we believe that there's going to be a huge emphasis on electric vehicle charging stations. That has very different implications if you live in California or someplace where you get hydropower versus if you're in Alaska and we still use fossil fuels to generate our power, and the cost and the distances. But we need to be aware of that. And there's other alternative fuels we should be thinking about. There's fantastic strides in unmanned aerial systems and pilot projects in association with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and opportunities to move freight differently using that. Again, big data, there's so much happening, which really tells us how people and goods move around. It helps us get people connected from the ferry to the bus because they can track it online. So really looking at how data is helping us. And then we would be remiss if we didn't at least address connected and autonomous vehicles. There's a lot of pilot studies. We believe they're still about 20 years out, but they're also moving into fleets and into buses before they're moving into private vehicles. So how much will these new technologies change the transportation landscape of Alaska moving forward?
Okay, Bruce hasn't spoken up yet today. So Bruce, why don't you go ahead, ask a question, go ahead.
Well, thank you for letting me speak. One of the things that I was struggling with this adoption of new technologies is the assumption of, you know, the duration of batteries and how do you put batteries out there in the climate, and the tremendous amount of energy that still has to go into the maintenance, deployment, and even though we're talking about transportation and connectivity, there's still this piece of, you know, if you had big data, what are you going to do with it? I mean, you take the road to Stewart and you see where, and you put a whole bunch of stuff on it. What are you going to do with it? I mean, it's still a 2-lane road and you're monitoring it for landslide or whatever. And so some of this new technology, even if it's available, how are you really, what are you going to do with it? You're going to have to maintain it, and how are you going to use it for performance metrics and things of that nature? So from my perspective, the connectivity piece is really what's going to drive a lot of this. And this new technology piece is kind of a come along as things evolve. It's a tertiary to the bigger needs of just maintaining and connecting Alaska.
Right. And so some of these will be like, kind of like what you said, they may be positive or they may be negative impacts, but they do have the potential to influence it. And I think Alaska suffers a little bit because new technologies are in the lower 48 and big data, and a lot of these are at the forefront and really changing things. They're not going to have that same level of impact in Alaska, but we also have to be considerate of, you know, what's this new transportation bill look like? What do federal performance measures look like? And how is Alaska going to respond to those? So again, trying to keep our pulse on these, but you're not incorrect, Bruce.
Well, and I also noticed you didn't put anything in there about 3D printing, which for Alaska could definitely change some of the e-commerce trends, especially if there was 3D printing facilities tied to the port of the port and the airport in Anchorage with the e-commerce, or even remote villages trying to mitigate some of the stuff. So I'm very optimistic that 3D printing will be more in the next 10 or 15 years, will be more widespread. It's just, I don't know what that looks like. So it's just a personal bias. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna start doing a little bit of triage so that we make sure we make it through everything today. But Aves, is your question or comment right now about new technologies?
My comment will be quick.
Okay.
You know, we talk about EVs, we talk about drones for delivering freight, we talk about big data, weather reporting, public safety, all those things. I think to a large extent, much of that technology is going to be market driven, and that if it costs too much, consumers aren't going to use it. If it's not reliable, consumers are not going to use it. So I think we're a ways away from a fully technological Alaska. I think of charging stations up on the Hall Road. I mean, how are you going to get the electricity to the charging stations to charge the EVs that need to stop every however many miles to recharge? That's going to be a huge obstacle. But you know, there are applications in urban areas. Anchorage perhaps would be a good place for EVs, or Juneau, where you're traveling relatively short distances. But I do believe that we probably shouldn't be trying to spend money on projects that just for the sake of spending money. Thank you.
And I think you're right. This is going to vary significantly depending on urban or rural applications, but there's also could be potential to leverage new funding if we're smart about it. So just kind of kind of keeping an eye on that. All right, next one. So workforce. This one has keeps coming up. So there's a couple of different subtleties to this particular one. It's becoming increasingly challenging to find qualified workforces. We heard this from the M&O folks at DOT, just people to operate the equipment, to clear the runways, to clear the roads, to just provide those day-to-day maintenance services. People are retiring, they're aging out. It's harder to replace folks. When you go to the rural communities, it's doubly hard because you just don't have a large workforce pool. The populations are small. We also talked about the type of work and workers are changing. And so you have to plan for people in an organizational structure that attracts and retains workers. We've got a younger generation coming up who are looking for flexible work environments. They're looking for a different kind of an organization. We're becoming more data intensive. Do we need more data scientists working and managing some of that big data? And then we also heard that sometimes it's hard for DOT to compete from just a compensation level. And so workers come in, they get trained, and then they move to a different position. So we believe that having a qualified workforce at all levels is going to be a challenge as we continue to move forward. And that applies to every single mode. Even Washington State Ferries just issued a news article, or there was a news article that they're having to stop some of their ferry service because they don't have enough workers. We're seeing the same problem in Alaska. So we're not unique here. This is getting reported nationally. I think this goes a little bit back to what Gordon was talking about. We kind of put economics and natural resource development together. They felt hand in hand. The downside, of course, oil's declining. We got a tight budget, but there is also a projected increase in employment for natural resources, not national resources, construction and tourism industries. So we're expected to grow 15%. Tourism is expected to bounce back after COVID. And as we've talked through this, there's even positives and negatives. So we can do a road out to Ambler Mine, for example, but we also have sometimes Native communities who don't want that connectivity because it is subsistence grounds. So how is economic or natural resource development going to influence transportation? Can we bring trains in versus more roads? And as we build these, will there be money to maintain them as we go forward? So there's a lot of different subtleties to this particular one that I think we have to be aware of, and we're going to vet out more through our goals, scenario planning, and performance measures.
Nils, you've been quiet today, saving it up. Your turn. Go ahead.
There's more to say, but just on this one, I don't know that decreasing oil production belongs here. The way you framed it in the driving forces really ties it back to funding, if that's what you want it to be about. There might be other conversations about natural resource development and oil production in terms of private-public partnerships or something else as a model for addressing infrastructure, but otherwise it doesn't belong there.
No, it should be on the funding side. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, Rich, one comment and then we'll move on. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment. You're mentioning that certain Native communities might not want a road or might want different things for transportation because of the fact that of using subsistence and things like that. You kind of already addressed that under population. I'm not sure you'd really want to attach it to this.
Okay. That's fair.
Okay.
All right. So climate change, this one's pretty self-explanatory. The cost to construct, operate, and maintain all the transportation systems is starting to increase, and that impacts the reliability of transportation across all modes. So we continue to think this will be a threat to transportation as we move forward. You know, worse weather, more maintenance of runways, more maintenance of roads. So population, this is probably where I jumped ahead, as Rich pointed out. Steve, did you have one before I jump ahead?
Yeah, thanks. On the previous slide, the only thing I wanted to change was that, you know, from a policy perspective, it might be wise somewhere to start reminding people to consider climate change in any designs for anything that are coming down the pike.
So yeah, I think if we maybe talk about resiliency a little bit, design for resiliency on this one.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Steve. All right, so population, we kind of broke out into two. And so This is stagnating population growth. We've been in a slow decline. We're forecasted to pick up a little bit. We're also seeing kind of a bigger out-migration right now. So population is a little uncertain right now. So what does that mean for the transportation system? We also know that the indigenous and native populations are really disproportionately disconnected. And here's where I should have talked about subsistence. I had it right on the slide, but I went off script. But for many communities, they have one source of transportation in and out. So how is the population growth and where our population lives? How does that impact how we plan for our transportation system? And then I want to go right into migration before we take any questions, and would love to hear from the Mat-Su on this one. I think Kim's on the phone. But seasonal employment is going to continue to play a role. We've got huge swings in our labor forces. You could kind of put tourism in here because we also bring a lot of employees up to serve the tourism industry. And a lot of the seasonal employments in remote areas that are underserved by transportation infrastructure. It's hard to get to some of these places. And then I think an interesting aspect is just population migration, kind of that rural to urban population movement. We see some migration from some of the more rural villages into those community hubs. We're also seeing people moving from Anchorage to the Mat-Su borough. And so when you start thinking about the Glen Highway and you start thinking about e-commerce and you start thinking about telecommuting, as people move out to the Mat-Su Valley, will there be that same demand to drive back and forth to Anchorage every day, or does that change? So we don't have all the answers yet. These are sort of these driving factors that we want to dig deeper into and understand a little bit better. And then also part of that rural to urban movement is climate change and having people move because of their forced relocate. Well, they're having to relocate just because of climate issues with their communities. So we think these are important things that could impact how our transportation network is working. No disagreements there, that all resonates as true. And then here is funding, which we will definitely move the oil conversation to because it is more appropriate here. But I think as Holly said earlier, sometimes when you're working with this every day, you forget to see the tree in the forest. But federal funding, we say it's expected to remain stable around 500 to 600 million per year. That's what it has been doing. The big caveat there is, what does the transportation bill look like? So that first one may go away. But we also have to be careful that with the new transportation bill, if we get an influx of money, how sustainable is that? And can we maintain whatever is done with that money? So I think we have to really be conscientious of how we leverage that funding and what the long-term impacts of that are. And then for just state funding to make that federal match and things that aren't eligible for federal funding, it's been relatively stable, it's declining, but bottom line is the needs far exceed what the state is funding for all transportation modes.
Go ahead, Aves.
Yes, thank you. Basically, two comments. The first comment is on population and migration. And I believe that there's an economic factor that could be ascribed to those two categories, because out migration sort of depends on what's going on in the economy. We find that, that the oil patches lost a lot of jobs and a lot of those people left, and that was governmental action basically that caused that event to occur. Migration from rural to urban is the same sort of notion, in that that as the people in a rural village find that there's no way for them to live in the way that they wish to live, they go to a place where they can find a job that will pay them commensurate with their skills. And then as far as the funding is concerned, one of the things that the feds don't pay for is maintenance. And I would suggest that there may be an opportunity, as we look at new transportation bills, that somehow or another a small piece of the appropriation to each state could be designated as available for maintenance and operations, snow plowing, paving, pothole repair, those kinds of things. As I was talking with someone yesterday, that we talked about the fact that there's a caption in the federal funding that's called interstate maintenance. Basically, as I understand it, that is a resurfacing of a piece of road, because that makes it then a new road as opposed to maintaining an old road. So just my comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I had some comments.
Who's talking?
Gordon Brower up in Barrow.
Oh, yes.
Within the North Slope Borough.
Yes, go ahead, Gordon, and then we're gonna.
You know, we've been working for about 4 or 5 years now with DNR in what we call A-STAR. It's Arctic Transportation Resources and Transportation, and it's more focused on community connectivity. For the last 40 years, many of the transportation planning and infrastructure planning up here in the Arctic has been largely oil and gas planning exercise in some of the areas in the Arctic where the trend of the oil industry, especially in America's National Petroleum Reserve, NPRA, the federal land, that the trend is going that way and heading towards the more populated areas on the North Slope. And up here, many of the communities are so disconnected, and opportunities to do things are very far and in between, and for communities to participate just by sheer vastness of the Arctic, the American Arctic up here, and so it's important that it not just be an oil and gas planning exercise anymore, but to look at how resources can be used up here locally as well. Like maybe 2 communities in the Arctic that we have fought for using local natural gas is Barrow. I think the Navy had the natural gas in 1947 through the 50s, and only was extended through petition to the local people in 1966 for the largest community, the hub. And right now we use the dirtiest resources like home heating fuel, diesel and stuff in communities, and heavily subsidized. The North Slope Borough subsidizes about $50 million annually to our community. So transportation infrastructure projects that can work in concentrically with industry, with the local needs to drive the cost of doing anything down. The cost-benefit analysis done for A-STAR talked about all of these different projects that would benefit with infrastructure. So it's important to look at some of the driving needs behind funding abilities and things like that for transportation infrastructure up here in the Arctic. I mean,
I think that's true all over the state, Gordon. And we've got about 6 minutes left. So I want to hear from Joe, and then I kind of want to go over the survey quickly. But I think the points you made is really a focus of this plan, is it's getting all the communities connected, because that benefits freight and people. I think it's a statewide issue. Thank you. Joe?
I have a comment in regards to I don't know to what degree the discussing what's going to be happening in the next 25 years. it has weight, but I mean, we know internet's going to get better. We know we can't even imagine what the technology is going to be for in 25 years. As far as the population migration goes, I mean, it's tragic what some of the villages, you know, are having to move because of, you know, sea levels and eroding of the islands. But the amount of people there, you know, that's the Matsu to Anchorage commute in one day. So, you know, treating these drivers certain ways is a lot of it's out of our control, but we need to almost, you know, emphasize on what we have in control. I was one of the few people that under other on this pre-results survey that I was one of those people that says, you want to know what we could really do to, you know, as far as the transportation plan, would it be a driving factor? A driving factor getting, you know, is a Kinnicon Bridge. A driving factor is, you know, being able to get outside of Anchorage. A driving factor is the roads to resources, or, you know, punching all the way through to Bethel. I mean, those are the things that would drastically change the transportation in the state of Alaska. And there's a lot of things that are drivers that we're just not going to have any control over whatsoever. So I just have trouble with it even being in the transportation plan. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Holly, do you want to go over the pre-survey results and then get the next ranking as we?
Yeah. So we about 5 minutes remaining. This is what 20 of the STAC and FAC members said going into this after briefly reading the memo on your own and having the opportunity to rank what you think the most important driving factors are. First, the most people chose funding as number one. Connectivity is second. Economics and natural resources was third. Workforce was high on the list. Population was also high on the list. Adoption of new technologies was sixth. Climate change, broadband, migration, and then other. So the things that we heard about other, Joe is admitted to this one, first one. So this is basically, what did we miss? What are we not thinking about? Another thing that was brought up is minimum levels of service and basic infrastructure as a driving factor. This one is interesting, transactional costs. The transportation system's contribution to the cost of doing business or operating or traveling within Alaska. Consumer behavior demand, rapidly changing trends in e-commerce is a driving factor for many modes. And then equity. Equity for disconnected regions as a driving factor, as something that's missing. So kind of what we want you to do now, and this will be quick. We want you to, so there's more people here than participated. We want you to do this again for a couple of reasons. And this isn't science, right? This isn't a scientific survey, but have you changed your mind for any reason based on anything that anybody's talked about? And based on our discussion today, is there anything else that's missing? And if you think there's anything else that's missing, maybe let's have that discussion now. There's no place for you to put that, but talk about that now. But I want you to re-rank these again in the event that maybe more people have an opinion or you changed your mind for any reason. So discussion, whether it's, did we miss something? Or do you want to talk about the ones that are here?
I have a question. I see the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on this board. Is this interactive to where I can press one of those and that's where I'm voting? Yeah. Or is that?
Yeah, and you know what? Michelle will put the link for you in the chat so you can see that and you can participate. And if not, I'll figure out how to have you participate after the meeting. Go ahead, Nels.
Okay.
I just want to recognize that we've got a minute left, and it felt like this whole meeting was rushed and there really wasn't the opportunity for us to be meaningful contributors to the conversation. I don't know if there are more opportunities that you can offer or longer opportunities, but I could have spent the whole time talking about Mike's presentation and probably the driving factors, or at least a 3-hour discussion. And I would just commend to you that I'd like to have more time to weigh in and contribute. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nils. I think we can figure out a good way to do that. Absolutely. Wendy, do you have any final comments that you want to?
Well, I guess a question for the group too is, I know everybody's busy. I know these Teams meetings are somewhat cumbersome, but we have people from all over the state. Can you tolerate a 2-hour meeting? Can we go for another half hour on future meetings? Is that just too long to stay engaged? We also recognize that many people aren't participating. We'd like to increase that. We would like to talk a lot less, but it also takes, we also want to make sure we hear every voice. One of the options is to break out into smaller group rooms, but then not everybody can hear the conversation. So I would look to this committee to help provide some solutions kind of in this new format, as we're all learning how to navigate it and what their tolerance is for the number of meetings and how long those meetings are.
The good news is that when we really prod you to do the pre-work, you do it, and there's a lot of participation, so that's good. Go ahead, Rich, you first.
Yeah, I mean, you asked what our toleration was for longer meetings or more time to have everybody heard. I mean, for at least most of the respondents in the room, there's a pretty high bar for what this means to us and what the stakes are. So I would suggest that rushing through like an hour, hour and a half. Yeah, I get what he's saying, and I agree. The stakes are too high to not take the time. I mean, the stuff on this stuff really affects most of us in large ways. It's the business I do, without a doubt. It's all I do. So anything that the state's going to do in that sense affects me quite a bit. And yeah, I would prefer that we take the proper amount of time.
Okay.
Thanks.
And we still have a lot of meetings left, so a lot of participation back and forth. Also, you can reach out. We've done interviews, so we will keep the meetings up, and we will meet more frequently. There's Holly White. Go to the next slide, and we'll just do a quick closeout.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're still refining the driving factors. I think what we're going to come back at the next meeting is we're going to come back with the updates to the financials that you had questions on. We're going to come back with refinements to the driving factors, and then we're going to start looking at that strategic direction. And this is where a lot of what we've been doing so far is kind of pushing out information. The next phase is where they are going to be more interactive. The next phase is where it's going to start to feel like maybe it impacts you. And we will break the agendas down into smaller chunks so that we can have more time for input, and try to be more creative with that. So did we have one more slide, Holly? Oh, I guess we didn't. So we plan on coming back to the Freight Advisory Committee in September. And then we're going to come back to everybody in October with more information. We'll continue to send everything out in advance. We tried to do this survey to help engage, help get input in different ways. I don't know if the pre-survey was helpful, but we can continue to do something like that to get a little more just quick input from everybody to help frame up this conversation. Was the pre-survey helpful? Was the homework ahead of time helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I'm answering from my perspective, running the meetings. There has been a lot more engagement. I feel like I'm having an easier time facilitating the discussion. I'm seeing some heads shake right now. So, and some of the chatter I got in the email was that people want information. They were happy to have it. So when people are forced to do that, it's helpful.
And this plan, I mean, it needs to be done in August of 2022 because of federal requirements. So it probably does feel a little bit rushed. It's a lot of information. There's a lot happening early on. But this next phase, like I said, is where we're going to slow down a little bit. We're going to hear more from you. We're going to have some separate STAC and FAC meetings, so you'll get more time to talk. But we have heard you, and we will continue to try to do better on this. But do please feel free to reach out at any time. We're here to answer questions. We're here to meet your needs and address your concerns.
Okay. Thanks so much to everyone. Appreciate all your time. Once the materials are on the website, I'll send you all a note so you know when to get them all. Okay. All right. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks. Appreciate the participation.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.